Madam President, Your Honours, we speak today on behalf of the thousands of victims and surviving families who have suffered immeasurable harm under the so-called anti-drug campaign conducted during the administration of the suspect, former President Rodrigo Duterte. We speak for families who cannot be here, mothers who buried their sons, children who lost their parents, the spouses who now raise families alone, and communities that have lived for years under fear and silence and that continue to bear the consequences of violence that swept through their neighborhoods like a storm. These victims appear today before you not as mere statistics or distant figures or images in report as pictured yesterday by the defense, but as human beings whose rights under the Rome Statute have been violated in the most profound ways. These proceedings relate to what has been labeled the Duterte's war on drugs and Duterte's bloody war on drugs. However, the campaign, as I will refer to it during my presentation, was less about combating the drug trade itself and more about policing poverty and social inequality. As the evidence on the record unequivocally shows, individuals targeted by Mr. Duterte anti-drug operations overwhelmingly came from impoverished communities where social mobility is limited and opportunities are scarce. Drug use, particularly methamphetamine, locally known as shabu, is often more prevalent in such low-income settings where people may turn to substances as a coping mechanism for their harsh living conditions. In these communities, structural conditions, including the absence of adequate mental health services, limited access to quality education, scarce employment opportunities, and the chronic stress associated with poverty, create an environment in which substance use is more likely to emerge. Therefore, patterns of drug use do not arise in a vacuum. They reflect deeper systemic inequalities and long-standing patterns of socio-economic marginalization. The campaign disproportionately affected the poor and marginalized, especially in urban informal settlements marked by high levels of poverty. While the rhetoric of war focused on eradicating drug dealers and users, it was the most vulnerable members of society, those with the least power and resources, were caught in the crossfire. A significant number of the ones killed had little or no criminal history and were often accused of minor drug-related conduct or perceived drug use by the authorities. These were people living in poverty, were treated as expendable by a system that failed to prioritize their protection and to address the structural conditions underlying their struggles. Rather than addressing the root causes of drug addiction, such as poverty, lack of education, unemployment, and inequality, the Duterte administration framed the issue as a criminal one, focusing on punitive enforcement over social responses. Mr. Duterte's response was a selective, violent crackdown of the most vulnerable, recasting conditions of marginalizations as grounds for criminal targeting, rather as manifestations of social injustice. Framed on its face as a campaign against illegal drugs, it in reality reflected broader social political dynamics, including the targeting of marginalized communities, the use of state violence, and the deflection of attention from deeper structural problems. Mr. Duterte is charged under Article 7(1)(a of the Rome Statute with crimes against humanity of murder and attempted murder allegedly committed between 1st November 2011 and 16 March 2019 in or around Davao City during the period in which he was mayor of a town, and across the Republic of the Philippines during his term as president of the country. The prosecution presented ample evidence showing that each of the contextual elements of crimes against humanity is satisfied at the required threshold for confirming the charges. During the period covered by the charges, the Davao Death Squad and the national network created by Mr. Duterte to commit the crimes carried out an attack against the civilian population within the meaning of Article 7(2)(a) of the statute, as reflected in a course of conduct involving the commission of multiple murders and attempted murders. The victims' accounts of events corroborate the prosecution evidence and show that the crimes they suffered were not spontaneous or isolated acts of violence, but rather a planned, directed, and organized attack against them. The attack was massive, carried out collectively with considerable seriousness, and directed against a multiplicity of civilians. The victims were all civilians. The repeated lethal operations were conducted in residential and other civilian settings. As already indicated, the victims largely came from marginalized communities, were suspected by the authorities of involvement in criminal, often drug-related activities, and together with their families, they were targeted in their homes and neighborhoods. The attack was widespread and systematic, and we refer, Your Honor, to Annex D and E of the prosecution pre-trial brief. The attack was widespread because of its large-scale nature and the number of victims. In this regard, the number of victims affected by the events within the charges is one of the most relevant factors to be taken into consideration for the purpose of determining under the chapeau of Article 7(1) of the statute whether the attack was widespread or systematic. The broad geographical spread of the victimization, combined with a significant number of victims, confirm the wide scope of the attack. As the prosecution has made clear yesterday and today, the instances of murders and attempted murders in the document containing the charges and in the pre-trial brief are simply illustrative of a much broader pattern of victimization. In fact, the actual scale of victimization extends well beyond the 49 incidents affecting 78 victims presented by the prosecution. The prosecution itself referred to thousands of civilians murdered. And we recall here the content of paragraph 73 of the prosecution pre-trial brief, as well as the remarks by Ms. Croft just 15-20 minutes ago. As reported by Human Rights Watch in a report published in 2022, since 2016, the Philippine police have admitted its involvement in the death of more than 6,200 people in drug raids across the country. In a 2020 report, the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights reported 8,663 deaths occurred in the drug war. The Human Rights Commission of the Philippines and domestic human rights group report death tolls that are 2 to 3 times higher than the UN figure. The attack was also systematic, well-planned, and well-executed, following a standard modus operandi. In many cases, it began with an individual receiving a visit or a phone call from an official from the local barangay, informing them that they were on a drug watch list drawn up by barangay officials and the police. In practice, these visits function less as warnings than as a means of confirming the identity and whereabouts of the intended target. As one victim reported, I quote, "A barangay official told my husband to surrender to the police because he was on the watch list as a drug user. He had given up drug use months earlier, so did not go. 2 weeks later, 3 armed masked men wearing bulletproof vests arrived at our home in Manila and handcuffed him. I could hear my husband begging for his life from outside the room. We were crying, and the other armed men threatened to kill us as well. Moments later, my husband was shot dead." End of quote. Survivors, relatives, and neighbors consistently recount that armed men typically work in groups of 2, 4, or a dozen. They wore either police uniform or civilian clothes, often all black, with their face concealed by balaclava-style headgear, masks, baseball caps, or helmets. They carried handguns. As one victim explained, and I quote, "On 6 June 2017, at about 9:45 in the evening, I was at home with my husband, and our children were sleeping upstairs. 4 unidentified men wearing helmets and bonnets arrived at home looking for my husband. They broke down the front door. I started begging them to spare the life of my husband. The men pushed me away. My husband was shot in the chest and fell face down. While lying face down, he was shot 5 more times in the nape and head. The children woke up terrified because of the gunshots." End of quote. Attackers frequently travel by motorcycle, typically with 2 individuals on a single bike. Often a van, invariably white or black, and at times bearing markings associated with police vehicles was also present. They banged on doors and barged into rooms. The attackers did not identify themselves or provide warrants. Family members report hearing beatings and their loved ones begging for their lives. And I quote again from the recollection of one of the victims. 5 masked armed men broke into our house in Bulacan province where my father was playing cards. We could see him kneeling in a surrendering position. The men grabbed him and slammed him into a concrete wall several times, and then just they throw him outside. We saw the shooting. We were just there. My father's face was bleeding from being hit, and he was begging them for mercy when he was shot." End of quote. Another victim explained, quote, "My father collapsed to the floor but still tried to move, begging for his life. Yet the men continued shooting him. I couldn't count how many times I was so afraid. We also heard successive gunshots from outside. Later we found that also 2 of our neighbors were killed." End of quote. The shooting could happen immediately, behind closed doors or in the street, or the victims would be taken away by the gunman only for shots to be heard minutes later and the body to be discovered by local residents. At times, bodies were dumped elsewhere, sometimes with hands tied or heads wrapped in plastic. Relatives typically found them after being alerted by policemen or by the neighbors. A victim recall, quote, "6 masked armed men broke into the house where a small group, including several teenagers, were watching television. The men arrested and beat 2 young boys they believed were drug suspects and then took them away on motorcycles. A half hour later, after hearing from a uniformed policeman, we," referring to the relatives, "rushed to a nearby bridge to find their bodies, both with gunshot wounds to the head, their hands tied with cloth. The gunmen were still at the scene, while uniformed police cordoned off the area." Another victim recounted, quote, "A week after his brother was killed, 10 police officers, some in civilian clothes, arrested my other son and took him to the local barangay office. That evening, masked armed men abducted him from the barangay office. Shortly afterwards, his body was found under a bridge a block away. When we found him, we saw that his entire head had been wrapped in packing tape and his hands had been tied behind his back. He had been shot execution style through the mouth." End of quote. And another one, quote, "The body seemed like it was just thrown out. The nails were removed, one eyeball was missing, stuffed by cotton." End of quote. Relatives and witnesses often saw uniformed police in the immediate surroundings of the incident, securing the perimeter. Special crime scene investigators typically arrived within minutes. In numerous cases, an unregistered 38 or 45 caliber gun and a packet of shabu were found placed beside the body. And instead of fleeing from the police, the gunmen would mingle with them. As one of the victims described, I quote, "On 7 June 2018 in the morning, I was at home when I saw my son coming back from his work on the opposite side of the street. Suddenly, I saw 8 policemen, 3 in uniform and 3 in civilian clothes. 2 of them crossed the street. They took my son and banged his head against the wall. They accused him of selling shabu. He denied. He was then taken to the door of the house. He was shouting, 'Mama, help me!' I took a piece of wood and hit one policeman. Suddenly, one policeman pointed the gun against my son. He shot twice, at the head and at the chest. While in shock, I saw one police officer placing 4 packets of shabu and a gun around the body of my son." End of quote. The same account of another victim who simply recalled, "After the shooting of my son, who was only 19, uniformed police showed me his body in the house and a 45 caliber handgun next to his body. I told them that my son could not afford and did not possess a gun, and therefore could not possibly have attempted to shoot at the police. I said he cannot even pay the rent. His sister paid the rent for him." End of quote. On occasions, victims were still alive when found by the relatives and taken to the hospital, where they later succumbed to their injuries. Survivors recount the terror and enduring feeling of still being hunted as follows, and I quote, "In September 2016, a police officer pretending to be a commuter boarded my tricycle. He asked me to pass by the police station. There, I was stopped by a group of men who turned to be police officers. I was taken to the precinct, beaten, and forced to reveal the identity of drug pushers. I didn't know. Later that evening, I was taken to a dark place and shot multiple times. Despite the injuries, I managed to escape and save my life. I still have the consequence of the injuries, and I feel deep sadness, anger, and fear of being caught again." End of quote. Another survivor explained, quote, "They killed my 4 friends kneeling and defenseless. I heard a barrage of gunshots, voices, and one officer saying, 'Let it be. Let's say they fought back and let's leave the evidence.' I lay next to one of my friends pretending to be dead. When the armed officer left, I crawled out of the room and headed towards the edge of a ravine. Holding my chest with one hand to stop the bleeding, I slid downwards and fell to the creek bed. I crossed it, climbed the hill on the other side, and walked toward the highway. There, I encountered someone I knew and desperately begged for help." End of quote. Although the charges concern only the crimes of murder and attempted murder, victims' accounts also reveal widespread acts of torture, ill treatment, and rape. Young people were particularly exposed to torture and cruel and inhuman treatments, including unlawful arrest. A number of victims participating in these proceedings were minor when they were attempted to be killed, and a number of victims participating in the proceedings recount the killing of their nephew, son, cousin, who was under 18 at the age of killing. And this morning, Mr. Jeremy provided the example of Kian de los Santos, who was 17 at the time of his killing. Reported forms of torture include beating, kicking, slapping, blows to the head, electrocution, and death threats. On several occasions, law enforcement officials used arrests, inclusion in the drug watch list, and drug-related accusations as a tool of coercion to perpetrate rape and other forms of sexual violence. In September 2018, a young boy was taken by the police and brought to the precinct. His mother recounted, I quote, "At the precinct, he was repeatedly coerced into confessing a crime he was accused of. 'If you don't admit, your life will be the price,' they threatened him. When he refused to confess, he was beaten with a gun and electrocuted. On the night of 16 September 2018, between 9 and 10, I received a phone call from my cousin urging me to go in a certain location in Manila. What I saw was a nightmare. My son had been discarded like an animal, his lifeless body lying on the boulevard, abandoned like a fish by the roadside. I rushed to the scene, but I was blocked by the police. I was not even allowed to touch or embrace my son's body. Even in death, my son was not treated with dignity. It was like they just threw my son out like a pig. I finally found him at the funeral home where I had to pay to recover the body. I had nothing. I was bargaining as if I were buying fish. In the end, I paid approximately 45,000 pesos to take my son's body for burial. Now I wonder, will justice ever be served?
Excuse me, Counsel, you have 5 minutes left.
Official police reports of these incidents invariably invoked self-defense to justify the killings, despite eyewitness accounts that portray the killings as cold-blooded murders of unarmed individuals. To bolster their claims, the police routinely planted guns, spent ammunition, and drug packets beside the bodies. While these official accounts contrasted markedly with the ones provided by the relatives, they were notably consistent among themselves, typically characterized the incidents as by-bust anti-drug operation, differing little besides the names, places, and dates. The victim was invariably described as a dealer who attempted to sell to undercover officers conducting a buy-bust operation. Specialized local anti-drug units, called Station Anti-Illegal Drug Special Operation Task Units, were usually involved. According to the reports, the victim, after being put under arrest, often uncuffed, allegedly pulled out a weapon and sought to shoot the police. In every case, the victim was killed, and none of the arresting officers were armed. In most cases, the police reporting having found shabu on or near the victim's corpse, and sometimes a gun. Often, after the killing, the bodies of the victims were brought directly to the funeral parlors. Families then had to start their calvary to find the body of their loved ones, and they had to pay high fees to retrieve the bodies. R/50082/25 had to sell the house to be able to pay for her brother's funeral and burial. Sometimes the bodies were instead left on the street or thrown into the water in a plastic bag.